So welcome everyone to the first episode of the second series of Prints and the Makers Book Club. For those of you who haven't been on one of these before, essentially what it is using my recent publication, Prints and Their Makers, as a jumping off point to have greater conversations, more in-depth conversations on things that either didn't make it into the book, I would have loved to have made it into the book, or natural extensions of conversations for us to have surrounding prints and the people who bring them into the world. When I first started the process of writing this book, for me, it was really important that the different roles that a print has in order to get into the world, the different hats that people have to wear in order for it to come into existence, be really gone into. And as these episodes have gone along, there's been these themes that come out for each night relative to the different guests that come through. And the theme that really seemed to resonate through the conversations that Sarah Kirk Hanley and I have been having leading up to this conversation really is that of persistence. So the persistence, not just of what it takes to get the print across the finish line through all the planning, the ideas, the proofing, the printing, but also the persistence of images in the world. And I just wanted to give like a little bit of context on what we mean when we say that as a primer for what it is we'll talk about tonight. Prints have the ability to really stand the test of time, stand up against it. This is the Diamond Sutra. It's the oldest known dated printed book from 868. And it's massive. It's 196 inches long. And why we know the date of it, it's printed on it. And so it was easy for us to date. And what's wonderful about this particular book is that it was also stated in the text of it that it was for mass free dissemination. So when we start thinking about prints and their purpose in the world, this idea of persistence, when we can go back to something that's this old, has been there from the very beginning of the concept of print in and of itself, something that can outlive us. Prints have had the ability, when we think about some of the printed material that's had a great effect on the world, the Gutenberg Bible is without a doubt something that had a major effect on changing the perspective of how people saw information, access to information. And this was really the power of the printing press to determine whose voice would have value and how that value could persist over time. And as we kind of move it forward, there are ways of taking something that was potentially ephemeral. This is what's considered to be the first fine art lithograph, and it was made by Alois Sennefelder, the founder of lithography, and it was a drawing done after Albrecht Dürer's drawings within the prayer books that he did for Emperor Maximilian I. So these were drawings, and it was in a private collection. And one of the reasons we have this image, which is a self-portrait of Dürer, is that Sennefelder reproduced it as a print. And the level of the quality of this was so high that it really changed people's concept of the potential of the medium of lithography at the time. So it took something that was in a very ephemeral state, the singular drawing that could have easily been lost over time, and created it en masse for long-term and perpetuity by making it an edition. So prints have served this purpose of taking something that could potentially be lost, so like handwritten manuscripts and turning them into books, and making them possible to withstand the test of time. And when you fast forward that, the Test of the Dean project that was done at Gemini, the LA Exuberance, I think is another kind of great conceptual example of persistence. Here's a project where the artist drew clouds, and because they were printed, it was a way of holding on to one of the most ephemeral things there is, which is a vapor trail or a contrail from airplanes in LA. And this suite of prints to me was one of the more aesthetically beautiful things I'd seen in a long time, and also conceptually really fit right in with her work. And if you ever get a chance to see these in person, it's absolutely astounding that these are drawn. They feel like photographs, but as you get closer and you look closer, you can start to see small remnants of the hand. And in this way, that kind of persistence of the image and the persistence of the artist's conceptual thought really carries through with the process. And I also just wanted to kind of, help prime the conversation, this image by Josephine Halverson. It's a way of capturing time, a moment in time over a period of time. What I really loved about this process that Josephine did with James and Peter Pettengill was this took about 7 or 8 months to make this print of a moment of a burning log in a wood stove that was in the studio. And all of that time spent on capturing this kind of memory of a moment, I think really encapsulates that ability for the print to persist and an idea or a thought at a particular time to be able to persist for us to be able to go back and to look at and to review over time. So in the back of your mind today, we'll be thinking about persistence and all of its kind of derivations. And to introduce our guest, Sarah Kirk Hanley. Some of you may know her who are on the list, and you may have known her in her many roles, but to try to do the best homage I can to all of the expertise that is coming with Sarah is she's an independent expert and curator and critic. That's the title, but she's so much more. Some of you may have known her from her time as the executive director of the Manhattan Graphics Center, also as a curator, associate curator of prints at the Milwaukee Museum of Art, as a print specialist at Christie's. And many of you have probably read some of her contributions as a critic and essayist for art and print. But the main thing that has kind of carried through all of Sarah's work is the fact that she's been a staunch champion for prints, for printmakers, the value of prints to not just artists and art enthusiasts, but to history, and in an attempt to update the canon of art history to allow a wider perspective and diversity of voices in it. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it on and to Sarah. And one of the main things that we have talked about was, especially in regards to Helen Frankenthaler, is how we should be looking at defining greatness and the concept of greatness when it refers to an art and an artwork. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to Sarah to get us started diving into Helen Frankenthaler this evening.
Need to unmute myself. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, thanks. That was a very, I'm like trying not to tear up. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Phil. Let me just kind of get this in actual slideshow mode here. You always get those prompts right when you don't want them, right? I don't know why it's taking a minute here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm coming to Frankenthaler again after 10 years right now. It's I wrote a piece that maybe some of you read about right after her death. It felt like it was kind of personal because I read Jerry Saltz's response, or he had written an obituary, and I just felt, knowing what I know about her prints, that it wasn't fully, it was dismissive, you know. It was, I mean, as much as I love Jerry, you know, it was just, it didn't feel right to me. So I wrote this piece that was called, but he acknowledged that she's controversial, of course, in this obituary. And I wrote a piece that was titled The Unabashedly Beautiful Prints of Helen Frankenthaler. And I argued there that, you know, that she made, you know, she was dedicated to this idea of beauty, and however difficult and fraught that concept might be in contemporary debate and criticism, for her, I tried to get around what that meant. And I tried to also emphasize her contribution to printmaking, which is incredibly important. So it's interesting that now, along with 9th Street Women and other books that have come out, including this, we'll talk about it in a minute, The Heroine Paint, which was an incredible exhibition and book that argued, by Katie Siegel, that argued, well, she was the editor and she was the curator of the exhibition. She was the editor of the book, that Helen Frankenthaler's contribution to the history of contemporary art has been undervalued, and that she is, and as famous as she is, she's often dismissed as, her work is just in the same breath dismissed as lyrical or feminine or too emotive, or these types of things. And in the book, she argues that, number one, it's back to that idea of greatness. Why is that a bad thing? Why are those pejorative terms? So the exhibition was pretty raw, and a lot of people didn't see it because it was at the Rose Museum, which is in a kind of a rural setting outside of Boston. But I thought we could take a minute and think about it. And this was from the press release. And then it was also reviewed by Roberta Smith. So we'll take a look at that too. This is the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation's page with a few installation views of the exhibition. So it started with some ephemera, including this down here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Is that possible to see? Yeah. So this is the Life magazine, where she and other women who are featured in the current book that is has been hot reading for a couple of years now. Ninth Street Women were featured in a big spread, and other ephemera and so on. The title of that Life magazine article was Women Painters in Ascendance. And when you read the book, you realize that at that moment, there was this equilibrium of genders in the New York school that pretty soon afterwards collapsed, and the women were kind of relegated to a lesser role. But in this exhibition, Katie Siegel makes a very strong argument that whether regarded and canonized or not, she has influenced a huge swath of contemporary art, beginning with, of course, color field, which is usually where she's put in a corner. But actually, she argues that she also influenced body art, performance art, and the pattern and decoration movement, and a number of artists working today who contribute to the book their own essays, including Laura Owens and other painters who are now part of the contemporary scene, and Amy Silman as well. And the arguments in this book are very compelling, and John Elderfield, a lot of major scholars contributed to it and made their own arguments. It is a difficult book to find now, but I encourage you to, if you're interested, to check out the book. You can get it from a library. I think it's out of print at this point, but at any rate, this was kind of the beginning, and then the book as well, which we'll go back to here. But I'm not sure why it keeps switching back and forth. So these are some of the artists that are discussed in the book and also were shown in the exhibition. And as you see, it's up to the present with artists like Mary Weatherford and Sterling Ruby and Josh Trout, and going back to, of course, her contemporaries as well. So the review by Roberta Smith shows this work, Flirt, that we those in the print world know also was converted to a Lincoln Center poster. But this is a large and unusually, that was not common. I mean, usually Frankenthaler would create her prints from scratch, as we like to say, their original prints. This one was the Lincoln Center poster was a benefit poster. So, and sometimes artists do that, right? But normally, I think the point here is that the critics and Siegel agree that it's time to reassess, Frankenthaler, and this book really set the stage for that.
And when you say reassess, can you help people understand some of the criticism that she faced at the time that still persists even more so? Some of the stuff that we had talked about?
Sure. So one thing that's often leveled against her was her privilege. Her father was a New York State district judge, and they were very wealthy. And she went to Bennington and had every privilege in the world. But if you read the recent biography about her, you'll realize she also had a lot of hardship, personal hardship. And another thing that's usually leveled against her is she was just a shameless ladder climber, dating Clement Greenberg and then marrying Motherwell, and that she just connected herself with powerful men to get ahead. Another one is that her work was too lyrical or romantic. It was too emotional and not, sort of those more left brain type, rational, or things that became prized later, like in the minimalism period, of course, that more kind of conceptual, cold approach. Those are some of the main ones. And she was cut down by even her own contemporaries in that phenomenon that is often played out throughout history, where women cut down other women out of jealousy or whatever. So Joan Mitchell called her the Kotex painter, and there was that whole idea that her work was about menstruation and these types of things. And in the end, though she was thought to be important, her influence was relegated to the color field movement, which had a brief period before pop and minimalism kind of took over. So in this sense, with this book and exhibition, the argument is that actually she may have been just as influential as Pollock. And when Phil and I were talking, he brought up an important point that the scholars struggle with too, which is, okay, so we agree we might need to rethink her influence and her impact. So why is it still, couched in this gender-based argument? Why does it have to be against Pollock? Or why is Pollock even mentioned in the same breath? And that is something that, to Phil's point in the introduction he gave, that I try to do is just highlight the work and let it speak for itself. But in the book, there's an essay by a man called The Men's Room, and he actually makes the same. He points out that that's very problematic to approach it from that perspective, and he provides a different perspective too. And I just kind of wrote a little summary for myself that I have to find, but it was more that the work should stand on its own, and you should look at the artists who were influenced by the artist in question. But it's something that he concludes, and oh, we've got my children in the background. We'll talk about this in a minute.
Yes, we will.
As we know from other Linda Nochlins and other feminist thinkers, one of the other things that traditionally has kept women on the sidelines are the demands of parenthood. But he says her work is really about a continuous and vital response to existence. And this is something that comes through in the new biography about her too, by Alexander Nemerov. And it's, I recommend reading it just for that reason, because this title, Pretty Raw, is exactly how she approached her work. She would come to the work with just an open, bare soul and get it out there, responding to whatever was going on at the time. But as Nemerov points out, it's not her personal experience, but more speaking for a widely human experience, and how that's filtering through her and getting that out on the canvas or print or watercolor or whatever format she was working in. So I think this point that Roberta Smith makes, that Frankenthaler altered painting's gender balance irrevocably and to an extent that we are only beginning to appreciate, is definitely true. So this is 6 years ago. And then, and this is the cover of the book. It's a little grainy. This is about the best picture I could find. Then we have 9th Street Women, which comes out a couple of years later. And of course, that's a wider scope, but it gives you the sense, if you've read it, of the struggles of each of these women in their separate ways, and how they were different, but how in other ways they had similar struggles to gain recognition. And that idea of persistence is the one that comes through, that each of them decided not to be mothers in a very, strong way. And maybe Grace Hardigan is the most extreme example, but having been a mother and then basically deciding not to raise him. And then all these other women made the choice to just never have children. And this is one part of their iron will, but also, and against the wills of their husbands, in the case of de Kooning and Pollock, who wanted children, but the women had to say, no, I won't have children. Now, this is very unfortunate that they had to make that choice, of course, but they knew it was necessary to have any kind of hope for advancing their career.
Right. I mean, and on the flip side, with those husbands, they were making demands of another person, and I think that says a great deal just in the way in which we present that as a topic, saying that they should have the space to have it all without having to do it all. And I think that's a big part of the conversation is moving forward when we think about why do we need to compare Frankenthaler to Pollock at all, when really it's about what the work did and has done, the contributions that the artists have made, and the persistence of their voice over time. And I think that idea that we have to constantly make justifications just based on their gender is part of like the bigger problem that you and I've been talking about so much as it relates to greatness as well. What's the definition of greatness relative to a male artist versus a female artist? And these women had to make some of the most unbelievably difficult choices to try to just allow their voices to persist.
Yes. And that almost, well, the feminist movement was not around yet, right? So each one of them really, they understood that they were disadvantaged due to their gender, and they espoused a sort of almost neutral gender in a certain sense. Like they would, I mean, Frankenthaler actually really enjoyed dressing up and looking very feminine, and all of them did, but then they often on the daily life were wearing men's clothing, and anytime someone asked them about their gender, they would deflect on that. And Grace Hardigan started out under, you know, the nom de paint, I guess you could say, of George Hardigan, and felt, I mean, but then later she said it wasn't because she thought people had to think she was a man, but more in homage to the writers, George Eliot and George Sanders, that she admired. But at any rate, that goes back, you know, centuries, thinking of those writers as well, that they felt the need that they had to publish under a man's name to be taken seriously. So I think, you know, feminism comes along later, but they had to develop their own sense of feminism, I guess you could say. That was different than what we conceive of it now. It's different because it hadn't been part of the culture yet. But here's the cover for the biography that was published earlier this year. And I found it to be a really interesting dive into her personal life, and it helps shed some light on this relationship she had with Clement Greenberg and what she was doing at the time, and those formative years where she was developing her voice as an artist and interacting with all of her peers in New York. And I would recommend it. Although you're left wanting more, especially because it stops in 1960 with her first major museum show at the Jewish Museum. And we all know in the print world that she was not yet even getting started with printmaking. So I felt that kind of usual, oh, I mean, the printmaking is also treated in a similar way as, you know, a stepchild technique in the greater art world. So that felt a little frustrating to me, because I really think her prints are extraordinary, and she was just getting started there. So this is a review that was in the New Yorker for the book that we just looked at. And Adam Gopnik isn't usually a cultural or art critic, but he had an interesting view that I think he comes from that wider perspective of being just a general critic of pop culture or life, and he chooses his subjects as he will. But he makes the same point, like at the end of the piece, he says, well, why is it bad that she embraced this, you know, kind of idea of making something beautiful and that expresses human emotion and is romantic, you know, in a sense. And this is actually what art has done for a long time. And in a book talk I moderated for the biography, we talked about how she was really influenced by Rubens and the Romantic period, you know, that kind of really emotive, what we might think of as over the top late Baroque period, to her was the epitome of painting. And that's a big part of that book. If you read it, a big section where she goes to Spain and spends a lot of time in the Prado looking at these paintings from that period. So it has to do with the whims of taste, really, in some ways as well. and what was became popular after her initial rise to fame. You know, it was a rejection of all of that kind of romantic feeling that is in it. So now we get to the prints. I know I'm checking the time here. I feel like I've talked a lot about the criticism, and we haven't even talked about prints yet. But her prints are, we're going to focus just on the woodcuts a little bit today, because that's probably her greatest achievement in the field. And also there's an exhibition on right now at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. So here we see her working with Kenneth Tyler on Madame Butterfly, and we'll take a look at that. But you can see this print. Actually, Phil, I found an even better image when I clicked on this link, because they have an
Oh, great.
front and center, a nice detailed image of this print. Which
you want to start off by just giving everybody a sense of scale on this, because it's really easy when you're looking at a computer to not grasp the size of this.
Yes, it is about almost nearly 10 feet wide. These are some of the other, that's a close-up actually, Tales of Genji series that she did beforehand, where she developed all the techniques that are in this Madame Butterfly. And there are a series of, I think it's about 25 prints, and they're each monoprint. No two are alike. So they're incredible, and they have, this one has 106 colors or something to that effect. And it was printed in, well, it was published in 2000. I imagine it took years to get to the point where it was ready to be published. So this is,
my memory serves, I think it took Yasu over 2 years to print it.
Right, just to print it. And even to get to the point where okay to print proof existed must have taken many years before that.
And for everyone to know, it's a ukiyo-e woodcut process is what they use. That's why it has such a beautiful watercolor tone and feel, and captures Helen Frankenthaler's aesthetic in such an expert way. So, and it's not what you would traditionally think of a ukiyo-e process or approach, because it's so diffuse and wash work. And
they worked painstakingly to get that effect of that it's on a wooden substrate. It's not, but it looks like it. And that's, I think it has, maybe it has a veneer of some kind, but I think it's all like illusion. He made it look several layers of printing to build a ground to make it feel like the wood. So that way you got that sense that this is the surface that the artist actually worked directly on. Yeah, it took a long time. So there's also, if it's closer to you, an exhibition of her prints, which is not limited to woodcuts, at UT Austin at the Blanton Museum. So that will close on February 20th. But going back to how this started. So this is her first woodcut. She had been printing intaglio and lithography at ULAE for a while before this happened. It was kind of it was a suggestion, although Phil, I think, has more insight on this than I do. I have the received wisdom of what happened and how this happened, but he has theories about what might have happened. So I'll let him talk about it.
Well, yeah, one of the things, the history of this process, a lot of people talk about how it was technically made, which was cutting the blocks apart and then putting them back together, inking them separately. And then it was about the difficulty of getting rid of a halo from how you put the blocks together. And so the way in which they printed to remove any sense of the blade width from cutting was a big part of the process for Helen to get it back together, to get it to feel like it was its same thing. One of the things that I always wondered about is, since the first printer that she worked with was Bob Blackburn, and there was a way in which Bob helped artists work at that time period. And this is, I believe it was in the 1960s when they made their first print, 60 or 61, first stone. And it was allowed Helen to draw on a stone and then basically pick what she wanted to be what colors. And so Bob Blackburn would do this process of separating her drawing back out over multiple stones to put it back together again in full color. And so this idea that she could take things apart and put them back together again was foundational to her introduction to printmaking. You know, and the environment that Tanya Grossman had created at ULAE was one in which, you know, the artist and the printer and Tanya, they all had this shared faith that the artist's vision was the thing that they all needed to support the most. And so having someone like Bob Blackburn, who really could help an artist realize their vision and really epitomize the printer's job of always saying yes and figuring it out later, I think created a wonderful foundation. And I've always wondered, because Bob Blackburn did a lot of woodcut, multi-block, multicolor woodcuts in a similar time period. If Helen's work influenced Bob, or if Bob influenced Helen in that period of time, because I know they did stay in touch because Bob was really well connected. And I always kind of wondered about how that came to be, because as we've talked about a lot, Sarah, Helen's woodcuts really did change the concept of the medium. You know, it broke it away from needing a black line or having to have some sort of like key definitive image, and it allowed a work to exist or just to be full color. So it really is kind of the first time that woodcut rivaled painting, or you know, entered that field of painting. And you know, and this is the print. This is the one that really changed it.
And it's that idea of rawness again, the rawness of the expression and the rawness. And she actually took her inspiration from the German expressionists, who were, as we know, very involved with a similar impetus. But she looked at the woodcuts of Munch and the Brücke artists and decided, I mean, basically she had a choice of two different approaches: the traditional carving approach or the jigsaw method. And that was the one developed by the expressionists, and she decided to go with that one. But as you see here, in the same vein that Rauschenberg accepted the flaws of his lithograph that broke, and Phil will be talking about, she accepted the flaws, or even celebrated the flaws of the wood here, and brings it out. And there's no question about materials here, and what that embrace of materiality and the characteristics of the technique in which she's working are some of the ways that the current thinking goes that she really influenced art. You know, that was, if you look back to, not, you know, here we get back in our old habits of contrasting her to Pollock, but his work actually was a little more reserved in that way. It was still had some figurative aspects to it, but she's just letting the materials speak for themselves and express themselves, and the colors to speak for themselves. And you know, the paper too, that kind of uneven paper that is not perfect, and accepting the flaws of, you know, being a human. You know, it just is very tactile and human and raw.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the things that I've always resonated with her work is her ability to allow chance to create a situation that she would then control, or really have specific ideas of what she wanted to do with. You know, so like taking that particular piece of wood with all of its flaws and printing it and seeing what it resonated with. This, here's what it is, I'm going to work with this, and then making that work. Really, to me, those early woodcuts really resonated so much with her early stain paintings, where she
Right.
was just allowing things to occur and then working within. So using chance as a driver or a start mechanism, you know,
Mhm.
and that was one of the things we talked about too, that she got a lot of criticism for allowing chance in, whereas someone like John Cage is championed for chance, right? Or Rauschenberg was championed for chance, and how these aspects are in one way for her, a lot of her male counterparts are used as something that makes them great, and in her case it's something that would take her away from greatness, you know. And that's her prints, I think, were probably one of those early forays into a medium where no one could really criticize her. I mean, they were just so over the top that was kind of the beginning of people having to deal with her just being great at what she did.
Right. Well, I always like to pat the print world on the back, and I feel like, because in this print publishers continued to invite her to work with them. They did not shun her to the sidelines the way the painting world did. And you know, she, in this article, which was written about 9 years after East and Beyond came out, Richard Field credits her with completely revitalizing this technique. And, you know, it had been, I mean, we know that certain artists were working in woodcut when she started, who maybe had a more regional focus, or, you know, that type of thing. But in terms of putting it into the fore of contemporary mainstream blue chip, whatever you want to call it, art practice, she did that, you know, and he gives her full credit here and goes through that completely. It's a great article to read, or essay. You can read it yourself on JSTOR for free for now. They're allowing people to read articles during COVID complimentary. So I encourage you to check it out. This is a piece that, this is a little excerpt from the article that I wrote recently, but the essay that I wrote, and it has this piece, Savage Breeze, on the left, which is a working proof, and it goes back to that persistence that we wanted. And that is the focus of the exhibition too. When you see the prints, they look so natural that you feel like it must have been easy to do this, right? Or they look easy. It's like watching a gymnast in the Olympics, like, wow, they just make this look so easy, right? Well, if you know the history of how these things came about, they were anything but easy. And it's incredible to realize her persistence in terms of realizing her vision for any particular project was boundless. And, you know, that has been leveled against her as well. She's been characterized as, I mean, that word that starts with a B, that is leveled against a lot of powerful women, you know, that she was difficult, uncompromising, all the things, exacting, unbending, you know, had her really strong ideas. These are things that are normally considered strengths in men, and then are, you know, leveled against women as faults.
Right. I mean, I can definitely speak from personal experience from having worked with Helen towards the end of her life, that I could understand why people would call her difficult, and I could understand why people would say she was particular, because the work mattered that much, right? That it was right. But there's no difference for her approach than any other artist that I've worked with that has dedicated their life to their work and their voice being heard in the world. They want to make sure, especially when they're working in print, that's going to be a multiple. They want to make sure that what they've had to say is exactly what they want to say. And I think with Helen, she was one of those few people who was willing to take the time, like in some cases, years. Like a print that I worked on with her, it took 3 years to finish it, right? Because it just had to be perfect. And, you know, you have to have a great deal of respect for an artist's persistence in that way, because they understand the value of their own voice and the clarity that they have within that. But they also understand that prints will be in multiple and exist and persist. So, for me, it's just like when we were talking about it before, like, yeah, I've never met an artist who isn't quote unquote difficult or particular or has a dogged pursuit of what it is that they believe to be right for their vision. And so the fact that that's used as a criticism against Helen Frankenthaler always boggled my mind, so that's what we would expect of anyone doing work to the highest level in any field.
Right. So with Savage Breeze, it was the first kind of difficult, she had a really hard time getting what she wanted out of it. And this is the last proof where she was able to kind of solve the problem of what was bothering her. And it's this black swath here that she added. And that ends up being more of a burgundy tone that you see here. She's basically showing the printer, I want more of this and bring it down here, and then let's cover up this, and I want this to be green, completely green across here. And to know that she's so bothered by that part not working, is to get an insight, I think, into her brilliance about the flow and success of a composition.
Yeah, I mean, the darkening of that area pops those white lines, those very thin white lines. And if it's not darker over there, you can lose them. And I feel like, those gouges in the block, that the woodcut element of the woodcut, that's there, those couple of white lines were so important to allow them to flow through, that you really needed that extra value punch on the right hand side to make it work, and she was right. I mean, for anyone who's seen the finished print, I mean, she was dead on the money. It works really well.
It does work.
So.
And this little bright orange, barely noticeable swath here on the left makes it all vibrate in a way that is not obvious, I don't think, at first. It takes some looking. But then she did Essen's Mulberry. She one-upped her game and did it again 5 times over until we get to Madame Butterfly. So Essen's Mulberry was, if you read the criticism over the years, it's just everyone gushes. They can't do anything else but gush about this gorgeous thing. And they can't help but use the word gorgeous and beautiful and, a universe, a scintillating universe. I think one of them says, you do have to see this in person. It may not be coming through, but this is her final working proof again, where she had gone through 24 different iterations at this point before it was the way she wanted it. And one of her final realizations was that it needed a transparent roll underneath everything, like that ochre tone that you see, which makes everything else so warm and almost it feels alive. And that is what did it for her. And it was titled Essen's Mulberry famously because she was inspired by this mulberry tree and the juice, that she wanted to get that feeling of like a fresh fruit, or the life that was in this juice out on the page, and this section of open paper at the bottom is what also harkens to the Japanese tradition as well, that scroll tradition. But also Phil and I talked about how I wanted to show these few works on paper which were done privately in her own studio around the same time. And you can see that she's really thinking about Asian art. And later she makes a print in Japan with Kathan Brown and other printers who were working and she created, some of you probably know this program of artists going to Japan to work with ukiyo-e, traditional ukiyo-e printers. So she was really thinking a lot about the Asian, the Japanese print woodblock tradition. And you can see that she's sort of experimenting here, just in her own private studio with some effects. And this one is almost like the same composition if you just flip it. We can go back, but that same kind of blob that's here is kind of shows up here. But this is a later piece. So going back to that idea of how the work in the print shop influences the work in the studio privately in a solitary painting practice.
And she's really been an artist who has allowed her viewer to see the materials consistently, to like see the bare canvas in the early works, to see the grain of the wood, or in the case of these prints, to see the paper, like those other pieces, so that she's not definitely not an artist who's trying to create a window into a world. She's showing you the world as it is with the curtains drawn open, and so you get to see it all, so that you can get lost in the work that she's made, but it's also grounded in the fact that it's been made. So there's this, when we talk about, like people wanting to compare her to Pollock, that's one of the major differences between she and Pollock. And I think the argument for her own independent greatness outside of that context is that she was presenting the world as it is, right? She wasn't trying to create some other thing. She was trying to engage people with the world as it is. And I think that was one of the things that was criticism levied against her, was that she was trying to show the beauty in the things as it is, right? Versus saying it has to be this other fantastical thing. And, so, I mean, the prints, I think, really help show that almost even more so than some of the paintings. It gave her the opportunity to really show that reality in the work.
Yeah. And then Gateway, which, as you can see, took 6 years here, 1982 to 88, to realize, is an example. And it appears in Katie Siegel's book, one of the only multiples or prints that you see there, as an example of her engagement with the decorative, or the screen form here in this case, going on to following from that influence she had of Asian art. But I think it's, it's brought up as an example in Katie Siegel's book and exhibition about how she influenced this idea that division between craft or decorative items and fine art. She collapsed that division, and that has influenced a huge number of artists over the years. But again, you see here through this, and you can download this yourself. It's available on the National Gallery of Australia's website. They have the Tyler Graphics Archive there, and a number of wonderful online resources for people to browse. But here you see how many people were involved with printing this, and the intensity of the project. She had to go to a foundry and do the armatures, which are bronze. She created special patinas for them. I think of Judy Pfaff when I see this, who makes as well her own frames and her own, is completely involved in every aspect of her prints, including the frame. So I think this is a wonderful kind of sequence to go through and read at some point if you have the time. But here you see the final product and the various, it's a variable print, there are no two alike, but 12 in multiple, I guess is the better way to put it. We're fabricated. So let's see, how do I get out of here and back? I know it's already 9 and we haven't even gotten to the Baskin collection. But there's another one for Madame Butterfly. I'll skip that. You should look into it, but it shows that printing process, and it really helps you understand how complex it was to print this edition.
I mean, as a good segue, one of the things that we had talked about too is that we're really fortunate that in order to be able to have this look back at Helen's work, that there's documentation, right? That people have archived the work, people have taken photographs, people have kept proofs, so that you can get a better understanding of her thought process and her working process, which hasn't always been the case, and especially hasn't been the case for women artists and women making contributions, which when we were first talking about what we would talk about, because there's kind of too many things for us to be able to talk about, and you brought up the Baskin collection. I had never heard of it, and there are two things that happened for me with that. One, it was like I was very happy that I had, and the second was I was really sad that I hadn't heard of it before. And so for me, the fact that this collection covers 500 years worth of women's contributions, not just to print and publishing, but to a lot of other things, is one of these amazing, extraordinary resources that hasn't even really begun to have been explored in full. So for you, if you want to like dive into this a little bit, because I feel it's really important for our audience here tonight to get some sort of a concept of what this treasure is.
Yeah. And thanks for staying on, all of you. We have so many things I wish we touched on again in our own conversations that we haven't even mentioned. I was just thinking about how we started with the beginning of the heroin paint, where Henry Geldzahler asks Frankenthaler in 1964, what does it feel like to be a woman painter? And what a loaded question that is. And her response is, well, obviously I'm a painter. I don't think about the how and the who. And so that's just the launching pad. The how and the who is what he's focusing on, not the painting, and but the reason that was, we talked about going back, that what made me think of it is you're talking about a physical record. And when I read those words from her, I thought of her economy of expression, not only with painting and artwork and prints, but also in her own words, which you get to know if you read her letters to Sonia Rudikoff, who was her close friend. And you realize how that really meant something when she said it, how and the who. And what she's saying is, I'm not a woman and I'm not about my drips and my splashes, it's about the work and what it says. And she's trying to refocus attention on that. But we were talking about how it's so important to have a material record of history. Otherwise it's lost forever, right?
Right. And we were talking about how, because she wrote letters, we were able to have that perspective, which I think is extraordinarily important for all of us to know and to hear about when we ask a question of an artist. What are we actually asking? Like, what is the assumed lens that we're asking that question from? And what are we really asking of this person when we ask the question? We wouldn't have had her astute response if she hadn't written letters. And we were talking about the lamenting of no one prints their emails out anymore, or saves the text messages, or so that we're going
to be lost.
We're going to lose a lot of
personal language. I mean, you get that sense when you read the biography by Nemerov, because he includes a lot of excerpts from her letters, of how she spoke. She had a very personal syntax, and that is true of anyone. And so that you can bring that perspective to just a short little quote like that and realize that was no accident that she says that in 8 words, and really gets to the heart of the problem in 8 words. So I think, yeah, it's too bad. But here we have a woman, Lisa Unger Baskin, who was married to Leonard Baskin, whom we all know as a printer as well, a printmaker. But he passed away. She's still living, and she's a scholar and antiquarian bookseller and collector. And her collection was just transferred to Duke University libraries. And well, maybe not just, it's been a couple of years before they were able to, create these resources we're looking at. But and the book was published. And this all came out right before COVID, and it felt like it just got lost in the storm of the pandemic. And I wanted to shed a little light on it and hopefully get people thinking about it a little more, and at least make sure they know about it, because it's extraordinary, really. She spent 50 years compiling this collection of documents of women's history. And a lot of it is, you have women going from all aspects of life: science, mathematics, activism, book publishing. She's got some documents from nunneries, theologians, all these women who contributed to history. Some of them are known. We all know the Queen of Navarre, Margarita Navarre, but others are almost completely unknown at this point. And some of them are quite astonishing in their, Phil and I both were aghast that we've never heard of this person who, Geronima Parasole, who also had a sister who was important in decorative arts, but her sister wrote a book about lace making, which probably influenced the boom in lace making in France. But this was a book that she illustrated and carved the blocks both for. That was a distinction to be made at that time. And, there was a different kind of, like in the ukiyo-e tradition, there was the person who designed the block and then the person who cut the block, and they were not the same person back then. But it turns out that she did both in this case. And Phil was marveling at the skill, of this incredible woman. So she's working in Rome at the end of the 1500s and a little bit into the beginning of the 17th century as well. And
the fact that she's credited in her initials, I think, was one of the things that we both remarked on, and were like, well, how many women were involved as designers, as cutters, as printers that we don't know about, because the records weren't kept, mentions weren't made, and all we got were initials at the bottom of a print. And when you think about the male gaze scholarly approach that we've all had for so long, that the assumption may have been that this was a man and not a woman for quite some time.
Right. So that's the achievement of collectors like Lisa Unger Baskin and other women who have amassed women's work over the years. Madeline Filion at the New York Public Library recently published an essay about the wife of the Reichscabinet print curator, Henrietta Kernan, who amassed a collection of women's prints that is extremely important in recording this lost history of women working in printmaking. And this is broadly defined, of course, as in terms of book publishing as well, but these early documents are some of the most rare, and it goes on through various, I'm probably making you dizzy up with all the scrolling, sorry. It goes on, and there are letters. I mean, it's not just books, but it goes, there are other types of ephemera and material documents that, needlework, all of these kind of traditional women's arts that have been considered to be unimportant. So that going back to greatness idea, and we know that a lot of the tapestries and important needlework pieces over the years were made by women. And so she prizes these things. There are letters as well. So I encourage you to learn more about this collection. And I think it opens up a whole world of realization that there were more women doing things throughout history than we are familiar with. And much more work needs to be done.
Do you want to show them the Phyllis Wheatley image? Because
Sure.
that particular publication and that little bit of text that's there says so much. And for me, one of the reasons for like putting this out there in this way is just to have this collection finding its way into as many people's hands as possible, for people to dive into what's here in greater depth, because we know that this is the tip of the iceberg. It's a really great starting point for so much.
Yeah. And we also were marveling at this woman today, Anne Smith Franklin, who was the sister-in-law of Benjamin Franklin. We should all know her name. She was an important publisher and editor of the first newspaper in the United States. She published a number of influential pieces of writing and theories that occasioned the revolution. So, it's somebody we should all know and should have learned about, not just Betsy Ross, when we're learning about the colonial era, but Phyllis Wheatley too. And there are a number of documents in this collection regarding abolition and enslaved people's letters and so on, that she uncovered. So this is one, the Phyllis Wheatley. This is the only known image of Phyllis Wheatley. And I believe this is the first edition of her poetry. So this is, she's uncovering the history of women across race and, and also economic status. Some of these women are totally anonymous and just made something of wonder, and that is beautiful. And there's an example, let's see, that I wanted to show you. This, maybe the last thing, just to end a note on someone totally anonymous. We don't even know where she lived, but she found this and felt it should be kept. And it's a lovely little clever artist book from the late 1700s. So obviously, over the years, there's much more to uncover, but it's going to take some serious digging, as Lisa Unger Baskin has demonstrated. She's really dedicated an incredible amount of work to finding these documents.
Right. I mean, for me, like, it's one of those things where you can spend an endless amount of time just finding an image and reading that small bit of text, because you're getting one paragraph. Those are unbelievably loaded with information, and just the gravity of how much of the history has not been included, right? And we've talked a lot about, that the more stories that we have that go back, the better we can understand who we are, because we know better who we were. and that, archives like this are really the way in which other people can get inspired to get that spark to dive further into having a better understanding of just what and who has made us who we are. And it's really easy for me to connect that Helen's work and the discourse surrounding her work with this collection, because there's so much of it has not changed in 500 years in the conversation surrounding quote unquote women's work. But we're in this moment now where that might get a chance to change. And I think, with a collection like Lisa Baskin's collection, that that could be a catalyst moment that we've got here for us. And so I want to open it up for any questions that you guys might have. I know we're going a little long tonight, but I still want to make an opportunity for you guys to ask any questions of Sarah. So go ahead and pop them in the chat. We're getting a lot of comments for people being appreciative of the presentation. I mean, if we want to circle back to that concept of greatness, I think that definition of greatness is one of the harder things to do without that gendered lens, because we've been so trained in it. But I'm kind of curious, as for you, having worked with Frankenthaler's prints for so long, how would you want to describe that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, for you.
Okay. Yes, well, anyone chime in with questions, but I almost wish we'd recorded our own preambles to this, because a lot hasn't been said. But it's greatness. I think greatness is something where a creative person taps into something universal, something that speaks across divides of time and economic status, all of these things. I mean, when you see Frankenthaler's work, you respond. There's no, and that is across the board. People try to put their own coding on it of whatever conditions they bring to it. But over time, her work has stood. That's it too. I mean, it remains, it stands, and it's important. We keep going back to it, and we're going back to it again now, 70 years later, 50 years later, 20 years later. The amount of exhibitions of Frankenthaler's work is astounding, and just even of her woodcuts or her prints. It seems like there's one every 2 or 3 years. It just, no matter how many people try to diminish its importance or dismiss it, it remains important to people, because it speaks to a place that we can all identify with. And I think, we do bring a cultural lens, of course, to everything. And that's such a huge part of today's thought. You can't assume that everyone comes to that with the same background. But I'll just say, maybe there are people out there who find no meaning in her work, but there are enough that do, and a lot who do, and that is why it continues to live on.
Yeah, and I think, for me, when you keep seeing these exhibitions of the woodcuts coming up, I almost feel like it's because people are rediscovering her work, and it's so moving that they have to show it. That there's, it's almost seems generational, that someone comes across it and says, well, why haven't we done a show of this? This is amazing. That her work has this ability to tap into people regardless of generation or even era. And I think it's because of that specificity of her voice and that persistence to make sure what she has to say, she's saying it as clearly as possible. And I think even with the greatest economy, you know, it may not seem it with 106 colors, but on a print, but she makes it look graceful and effortless, which is the hallmark of a professional, you know.
Right. I mean, I think that's only known or even nerded out about by people like us, you know, anybody who are, you know, really into printmaking. But the people who come to it with no prior knowledge of technical knowledge of printmaking, they still are in awe of it as a visual experience, you know, and I think it's hard to deny, you know, it's just gets to you. But
yeah, I mean, maybe that's the definition of greatness. It's hard to deny.
It won't be denied. It persists.
It's persistent, you know, for that theme for the night. I mean, you know, I think that it's hard for so many to separate the criticisms levied against Helen Frankenthaler when they look at her work. And I wonder how much of this resurgence in Helen's work comes from viewing the work versus having read or heard about the work, right? So from people who didn't necessarily learn about her in the context of traditional Western art history, but learned about her through her work first, right? You know, and thinking about, so not getting that really pigeonholed misogynist narrative view of her work, but actually getting to see the work first. You know, it's like, it's that difficulty that, you know, we as writers and as practitioners of the craft, we're always trying to get people to be with the work first, right? To have that primary experience, to use any of our writing to push people to the work, right? Because it inspires them so much that they want to see it rather than dismiss the work, right? And so maybe, you know, some of that getting people to the work first and trying to eliminate some of that past narrative, you know, it's kind of the work that we all have to do, is to try to help people see the work first, you know.
right.
Bob Blackburn always used to say it's about prints. He says it should be art first that happens to be a print. If the first thing it is a print, you've kind of failed as a printer. You know, if someone says, wow, that's a great etching, you're just like, no, it should be a great work of art first,
right?
You know, because that means the artist's voice has been heard as the primary, right? And I think with Helen and her graphic works in particular, they've always read as art first. And like, that's the thing you respond to. You respond to the image first, and then you're like, oh, that's a woodcut. That's insane. Like, you're not necessarily thinking woodcut the first second you see it, you know. So you're thinking about the work that's there. And so I think, you know, that's one of her greatest achievements as a printmaker, is to be able to engage us directly in that visual communication, that kind of visceral, full body mind communication.
Yeah. And I think seeing work in person is always, I mean, I was finally able to go to the Armory and see real art for the first time in a long time. And I realized how much I've been missing, you know. So I really wish I could go to London and see this exhibition. A lot of these prints I've only seen in reproduction. Even through my experience at Christie's and various appraisals that I've done, and visiting print workshops and so on, there are a number of her prints I've never seen in person, but I've just kind of absorbed them through other people's responses or their own gawking at them, you know. And knowing that it must be incredible to see them. And one of them is Free Fall. I've never seen in person. It's huge, you know, and my understanding is it's like being in front of a waterfall, you know, this humongous blue thing, you know. You think of, with all these nuances of color, and, you know, I would love to see it someday, but I'm sure it's an incredible aesthetic experience.
Yeah, that's one I've never seen either. And I've
Mm.
seen a lot of her work as a printer and worked in a lot of different print shops that she's worked in and worked with her. But yeah, there's some of those big ones that even the print shops they're made in, they don't have them out.
Right.
We don't have the space to put those kinds of things up. But, and, it takes a great deal of faith. It's just something else to say on how her contributions were recognized in the print world. It takes a great deal of faith to commit that amount of time and people resources, monetary resources to produce works like that. To say, okay, well, this is going to take 3, 4, 5, 6 years to make, but it's worth doing. And I think that really should tell people a great deal that someone's willing to put their own money up on a risk that it's going to work because of their faith within the artist for that much. And I think that's another one of the things that carries through with Helen Frankenthaler's work is that, her clarity of voice and intention as an artist is so clearly felt that it made it almost easy for the publishers and the printers to say yes versus say, no, we're not going to make that 10-foot print. So they're just like, okay, we're making a 10-foot print. So let's figure out how we're going to do it. And so I think, that says a great deal that people said yes, that it's not.
And continue to say yes. Even when people thought abstract expressionism was no longer relevant. And, here they're still working with her up until the moment she died, really. She continued to be invited to work.
Well, I mean, for me, I think she really embodies that expression is always relevant, right? And it's that idea of abstract expressionism as a concept. It's thought-based philosophical concept may no longer be relevant, but expression certainly is. And I think she superseded that movement by fully embodying expression, right? And so you may not like what she expresses, but that's a completely different thing than the fact that she was great at expressing what she saw and what she felt was valuable, and that's obviously resonated with a good many people. I'm going to share my screen with you guys real quick and kind of a closing, because I want to make sure that for the visual record here for the online, that some of the links that Sarah was talking about are here, if you guys can see that. Here we go. That these links are there so that you guys will be able to go back and maybe check out some of these things. If any of you want some of these links, you can always feel free to email me and I can email these on to you directly, especially when you think about the Lisa Unger Baskin collection. If you need that link, if you're having a hard time remembering it or finding it, I'm going to forewarn you, if you go onto that website, be prepared to be there for a long time. It's almost impossible not to get lost in there. And it's just insane what has been amassed there. And, and I want to take this time to thank Sarah for lending her voice and her expertise for all of you tonight. And, just reiterate that as an arts professional, she's a writer, she's a critic, she's a curator. She's also an art appraiser. So if you need help, she's a person that you can reach out to in order to get some of that, especially with things relative to print. And if there aren't any other questions, we'll end it up here tonight. And I just want to thank all of you for coming. The next book club event will be in 2 weeks' time. We do this every 2 weeks about through the fall. There'll be 6 of them. And it's with Sarah Burney, and we'll be going over the life, the work, and the influence of Zarina. Many of you may know as Zarina Hashmi, who's another one of these unbelievably important and influential women in the history of art and print, who we're only kind of beginning to get the tip of the iceberg of their legacy of influence. I think Helen Frankenthaler certainly fits into that category of, it's going to take us a long time to really understand just how much impact she has had on art now, what that's done for our society. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you, Sarah. And we'll
Thank
see
you,
all.
Phil. It's a
We'll see you all next time. All right.
great experience. I was happy to be here. My pleasure.
You're welcome. Great. We'll talk again soon. Okay. Good night.
Good night.